July 4th, 1187. A scorched valley in Palestine, wedged between two hills the Arabs called the Horns of Hattin. The air here is a natural furnace, a geological trap where an entire Christian kingdom met its end. This is a place and time of predetermined doom, and at the center of this catastrophe is a single figure whose story led him here. At the heart of the army, encircled by a Saracen sea, stands King Guy de Lusignan, his lips cracked and blackened by thirst, and his inflamed eyes speak of complete exhaustion. The battlefield has become a slaughterhouse, and the crown on his head is no longer a symbol of power, but a wreath of monumental failure. The king's gaze wanders across the field, seeing only defeat. And beside this broken monarch lies the last hope of his army. In the last pocket of Christian presence, inside the red tent, a bishop, with his last ounce of strength, raises the greatest of relics to the merciless sky. It is the true cross, a fragment of the wood on which Christ was crucified, encased in a setting of gold and jewels. It is an appeal to a higher power, now that all earthly strength is gone. But today, even this sacred artifact remains silent. Gazing at the useless relic, Guy de Lusignan replays his entire journey in his mind. The cross, which had once granted victories, is now silent, as if God himself has turned away from them. The king's entire life flashes before his eyes, starting from the very bottom, from humble origins in distant Poitou, where the younger son of a poor family had no prospects. He was an adventurer who set out for the east, to the fabled lands of Outremer. There, guided by his sword, luck, intrigue, and the love of a beautiful woman, he made an incredible ascent. Marriage to the king's sister, regency, the crown. He reached a summit that a landless knight could never have dreamed of. He got everything he wanted. But here, on the cursed hills of Hattin, all his triumphs have turned to dust. The flower of chivalry, his entire army, is annihilated. The Templars and Hospitallers are dying in a desperate, hopeless fury. His barons, who just yesterday were arguing at the war council, now lie in the dust. And from a hill, under a yellow banner, the architect of this catastrophe watches the slaughter. The Sultan of Egypt and Syria, Saladin. With this battle, Guy de Lusignan signed the death warrant not only for his army, but also for Jerusalem, which had only weeks left. He signed off on the end of an entire era for the Crusaders in the Holy Land, becoming the last crowned monarch to rule in that city. But his personal story is not yet over. Ahead lie captivity, shame, and a new, completely unexpected rise to another throne on a distant island. Here, under the sun of Hattin, he is living through his personal apocalypse, the king who destroyed a kingdom. His name should have been cursed through the ages, a synonym for incompetence and collapse. However, history is always more complex than the victor's verdict, and in his fate, there is more than a simple declaration of guilt. This is a story of how ambition can raise a man to the pinnacle and cast him into the abyss. But before we follow Guy's fall, we must understand who he was. He was not a product of the Holy Land. His character and destiny were forged in a completely different world, the feudal France of the early Middle Ages. He was a product of his era, 12th century France, with its brutal customs and strict laws. His family, the House of Lusignan from the county of Poitou, was ancient and noble. But the key to his fate lay in the suffocating system of inheritance known as primogeniture, which determined the future of every aristocrat. The Lusignans were powerful vassals of the Dukes of Aquitaine, who at that time were the English Plantagenets. Owning an imposing castle in the rebellious land of Poitou, they were famous for their defiant spirit, and their origin was shrouded in the sinister and beautiful legend of a fairy ancestress, which gave the family a special, mystical status. According to legend, the founder of the line was the fairy Melusine, half woman, half serpent. She married a mortal knight, but left him when he broke a taboo and saw her true form on a Saturday. This myth not only gave the Lusignans an aura of the supernatural, but also seemed to hint at their dual and perhaps cursed nature, hidden from outside eyes. In the 12th century, the Lusignans fully lived up to their reputation. They were known for their violent temper, immense pride, and constant involvement in feudal conflicts. Guy's father, Hugh VIII, was a typical representative of his warlike lineage, ambitious, ferocious in battle, and importantly, a very prolific lord. And therein lay the central drama. Hugh had 7 sons, and the ruthless system of primogeniture was simple. The eldest son inherited absolutely everything: lands, castles, and titles. This system was designed to prevent the division of estates and preserve the family's power, but it shattered the futures of all the others. For younger sons, primogeniture was tantamount to a sentence. Raised as warriors and aristocrats, they had no right to a single piece of their father's land. They were noble but poor, and only 3 life paths, 3 career options, lay before them in this cruel world, where birthright decided everything. The first path led to the church. A career as a priest, abbot, or bishop could bring honor and considerable wealth. However, it required a complete renunciation of worldly life, of marriage, and most importantly, of war. For the proud and warlike Lusignans, whose very essence was battle, this option was the least suitable. The church was not for them. The second path was to become a landless knight in the service of a more powerful lord, a king, a major feudal magnate, or even one's own older brother. This offered a chance of a good marriage to a wealthy heiress, or receiving a small fief for loyal service, but it was fraught with a humiliatingly dependent position and constant risk. The third path was the riskiest and the most alluring. It led to the east, to the Crusader states, which the Franks called Outremer, the land beyond the sea. These were Christian feudal kingdoms founded on Muslim soil after the First Crusade. Jerusalem, Tripoli, Antioch. This was a frontier world, a world of great opportunities. Outremer was the true promised land for younger sons. Here, the harsh laws of primogeniture were not so strictly applied. A man was judged not by his inheritance, but by the valor of his sword and the strength of his spirit. Here, one could marry the heiress of an entire barony, be given control of a rich city, or even marry into the royal family. Here, every man could forge his own destiny. Guy de Lusignan was a typical representative of such fortune-seekers. Handsome, well-built, and an excellent warrior, he had absolutely no future in France, where all the wealth and honors were destined for his older brothers. He had all the makings of success, but no chances at home. Furthermore, the Lusignans had a personal family history connected to the East. Their grandfather had participated in the Second Crusade, and their father, Hugh VIII, had died in Saracen captivity after the Battle of Harim. For his sons, the journey to Outremer was not only a chance for a better life, but also a matter of family honor, an opportunity to avenge their father. They were drawn not just by the thirst for gold, but also by the thirst for blood. However, Guy's path to the east began not with a pious pilgrimage, but with a crime. Around 1168, he and his brothers ambushed and killed a powerful English aristocrat, the Earl of Salisbury. The motives for this act are obscure, but it forever changed their fate, turning them into exiles. Their overlord, Richard the Lionheart, who was then Duke of Aquitaine, banished the brothers from their ancestral lands. Now, Europe was closed to them. The road to Outremer transformed from a matter of choice into a matter of survival. Guy de Lusignan simply had no other path left. So, he set out for the Holy Land, not as a pilgrim, but as an exiled adventurer with a tarnished reputation. Ahead of him lay a choice: to find glory and riches, or to vanish without a trace in the sands of history. Fate, in its peculiar irony, had both in store for him: the greatest ascent and the greatest fall, which would make his name immortal. Before we continue Guy's story, it's essential to understand the world he arrived in. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 1170s was a place of astonishing paradoxes. This island of the Latin West, transplanted onto Middle Eastern soil, had put down deep but very fragile roots over the century. A society living under constant threat had achieved an incredible level of luxury. Geographically, the kingdom was a narrow strip of land along the Mediterranean coast, studded with cities like precious gems: Acre, Tyre, Beirut, Jaffa. Their names were music to any Christian's ears. And the crown of this necklace, its heart and soul, was, of course, Jerusalem. Life thrived in these cities, creating a bubbling cauldron of cultures. Italian merchants controlled the trade, while knights in Arab burnouses, Syrian Christians, Armenian traders, and Greek priests walked the streets. Latin, French, Arabic, and dozens of other dialects mingled in the air. It was a cosmopolitan world at the crossroads of civilizations. The ruling class, the Frankish barons, descendants of the first Crusaders, were no longer rough European warriors. Born in this land, they had adopted Eastern luxury, appreciating baths and exquisite cuisine. Many of them preferred diplomacy and maintaining a balance of power over perpetual war, believing it was the only key to the kingdom's survival. However, this prosperity was deceptive. The kingdom was demographically doomed. The Frankish Catholics, numbering no more than 150,000, were a ruling minority surrounded by a sea of local population. And beyond the borders, in Damascus, Cairo, and Aleppo, the Islamic world was gathering strength, striving to unite for a holy war. The center of this political web was the royal court in Jerusalem. And at the moment of Guy's arrival, it was a hotbed of intrigue and deep tragedy. On the throne sat the young King Baldwin IV, who could have become one of the greatest rulers of his time, were it not for his terrible, incurable disease. Baldwin ascended to the throne at 13, already knowing his fatal diagnosis. In his childhood, his tutor, the historian William of Tyre, discovered that the boy felt no pain in his arm. The doctors delivered the verdict: leprosy. In the Middle Ages, this was not just a disease, but a sign of God's punishment, making a person an outcast from society. Despite this, the young king showed incredible strength of spirit and political acumen. He personally led troops into battle, winning brilliant victories, such as at the Battle of Montgisard, where, as a teenager, he utterly defeated the army of Saladin himself. He earned immense respect from both his subjects and his enemies. Everyone understood that his reign would not be long. The king could not marry and leave an heir, and this uncertainty split the court into two warring factions. The kingdom lived in anticipation of his death, and court factions fought a bitter struggle for the future that would come after he was gone. The first faction, the Peace Party, was led by the most powerful feudal lord in the kingdom, Raymond III, Count of Tripoli. He and his supporters, the local Ibelin clan, were born in the Holy Land and believed the kingdom was too weak for aggressive warfare, They advocated for a cautious policy and adherence to truces with Saladin, prioritizing survival over ideological dogma. Their opponents were the court party, or the war party. This was a motley group that rallied around the royal family. Its soul was the new men, adventurous knights who had recently arrived from Europe. They yearned for glory, land, and booty, and scorned the caution of the local barons, believing that the only way to speak to the Saracens was with the sword. The most flamboyant and reckless representative of this party was Reynald de Chatillon. A former prince of Antioch, he combined incredible bravery, equally incredible cruelty, and immense greed. His constant predatory raids on Muslim caravans repeatedly broke truces and provoked Saladin into retaliatory actions. Caught between a rock and a hard place, the ailing King Baldwin, while he had the strength, restrained the ambitions of both parties. But the main question poisoning all the kingdom's politics remained unresolved. Baldwin had a sister, Princess Sibylla, next in line to the throne, and her fate would decide everything. Whoever married Sibylla would become the future king of Jerusalem. Her hand was the most coveted prize in the Christian world. And it was into this intrigue-ridden, boiling cauldron that Guy de Lusignan, an unknown exile from Poitou, arrived in 1180. He was entering the game as a dark horse from whom no one expected anything. Lacking land or wealth, Guy possessed what turned out to be most important: dazzling knightly beauty and the support of his older brother, Aimery, who had already managed to build a brilliant career at court. His main assets were his looks and his connections. Guy's path from exile to de facto ruler was as swift as a falcon's flight, and it was explained not so much by his personal talents as by a fortunate confluence of circumstances, the patronage of influential forces, and, not least, an all-consuming love affair. He found himself in the right place at the right time. He did not arrive in a vacuum. His older brother, Aimery, a clever and charming courtier, had already firmly gained the trust of the royal family and had been appointed Constable of Jerusalem, the commander-in-chief of the army. It was Aimery who introduced his handsome younger brother into the high society of the court, opening all doors for him. Guy's appearance caused a sensation. At a court where the men were mostly battle-hardened, scar-covered warriors, his classic, almost divine beauty, which contemporaries wrote about, stood out sharply. And most importantly, he was noticed by the one on whom everything depended, Princess Sibylla. Sibylla, a young widow with a young son and heir, was at the center of the political storm. The local barons wanted to marry her to their own candidate, Baldwin of Ibelin. The king and his mother were seeking a noble husband for her in Europe. Her fate was being decided by everyone except herself. But the princess had her own plans. Passionate and strong-willed, Sibylla, as an Arab chronicler wrote, loved him beyond measure. She fell in love with the handsome Poitevin, and this passion perfectly aligned with the interests of the court party. They saw in Guy the ideal candidate, handsome, noble, but with no connections in the Holy Land and completely dependent on them. Love became an instrument of politics. Events unfolded rapidly. In the spring of 1180, Raymond of Tripoli marched with an army toward Jerusalem to force the king to accept his candidate as Sibylla's husband. Acting preemptively, Baldwin, under pressure from his sister and mother, hastily married Sibylla to Guy de Lusignan on Easter. This wedding was a preemptive strike in the political struggle. When Raymond and his supporters arrived in the capital, they were presented with a fait accompli. The marriage split the kingdom in two. The local barons were furious, considering Guy an unworthy upstart. Their opinion was voiced by the historian William of Tyre, who wrote of Lusignan with undisguised contempt. The conflict between the factions escalated into open hostility. At first, it seemed that Guy would live up to expectations. King Baldwin's health was rapidly deteriorating, progressing leprosy, blindness, non-healing ulcers. He could no longer sit on a horse and lead the army into battle. In 1182, the monarch was forced to appoint Guy de Lusignan as regent, granting him full authority over the kingdom. But Guy failed this test spectacularly. During another of Saladin's invasions, provoked by a raid from Reynald de Chatillon, he gathered the entire army, but showed extreme indecisiveness. He never gave battle. Formally, the invasion was repelled, but for the knighthood, eager for a fight, it was a disgrace, and Guy earned accusations of cowardice. The real disaster for his reputation occurred in 1183. Saladin besieged the castle of Carac, which belonged to Reynald. The siege coincided with a wedding being celebrated there. Inside the castle, a feast was underway, while catapults bombarded it from the outside. Legend has it that the bride's mother sent Saladin a dish from the feast, and the Sultan, showing chivalry, ordered his men not to fire on the newlyweds' tower. Guy once again led the army to relieve the besieged castle, and once again, the same story repeated. He did not dare to attack Saladin. The two armies stood facing each other, after which the Muslims withdrew unhindered. For King Baldwin, this was the last straw. The enraged monarch deemed his brother-in-law a worthless and cowardly commander. Returning to Jerusalem, Baldwin performed a dramatic act. He stripped Guy of the regency and attempted to annul his marriage to Sibylla. When Lusignan took refuge in his city of Ascalon and refused to appear at court, the dying king personally set out to besiege him. The marriage was not dissolved, but Guy fell into complete and final disgrace. To permanently remove his brother-in-law from power, the king took an extreme step. He had his 5-year-old nephew, Sibylla's son, crowned during his own lifetime, proclaiming him King Baldwin V, and Raymond of Tripoli, the leader of the party hostile to Guy, was appointed regent for him. It was a complete and unconditional political defeat. It seemed that Guy de Lusignan's career was over. He had lost power, respect, and trust, once again becoming a nobody, the despised husband of a princess. Sitting in his Ascalon, humiliated and defeated, he underestimated only 2 factors: the persistence of his wife and the fragility of human life. Fate was preparing a new, completely unexpected turn. To understand the full drama of that time, one must look away from the figure of Guy and focus on the central tragic figure of the era, King Baldwin IV. His short, agonizing life was the pivot around which the entire politics of the kingdom revolved. He was the sun, and everyone else, including Guy, was merely a shadow cast by his fading light. For his kingdom, Baldwin was both a miracle and a curse. A miracle, because in his disease-ravaged body lived the spirit of a true crusader, a wise ruler, and a fearless warrior. A curse, because his incurable illness made the future unpredictable, turning the court into a viper's nest of intrigue, where everyone vied for power in anticipation of the monarch's imminent death. His reign began with a miracle. In 1177, at the age of just 16, he led a handful of warriors to attack Saladin's massive army at Montgisard. The Sultan, underestimating the danger from the young king, made a fatal mistake by allowing his troops to disperse for plunder. Baldwin did not miss his chance and ordered a daring charge. The sudden, furious assault of the ironclad knights, led into battle by the king himself, sent Saladin's vast army into a panicked retreat. The holiest relic, the true cross, was carried before the army, and the charge was so relentless that the Muslims broke. The defeat was total, and the Sultan barely escaped, fleeing to Egypt on the back of a dromedary camel. This victory secured the kingdom for a time and established Baldwin's reputation as a true hero. However, the disease continued to relentlessly sap his strength, disfiguring his face. The popular image of the king in a silver mask, known from films, is most likely an artistic invention not confirmed by contemporaries, but it accurately conveys the monarch's tragedy. Even when blind and unable to walk, he remained king until his last breath. When Saladin again besieged Kerak, Baldwin ordered that he be carried at the head of the army on a litter. The mere sight of the royal palanquin made the Sultan, who held immense respect for his enemy, retreat without a fight. His spirit was stronger than his approaching death. It was this living martyr on the throne whom Guy de Lusignan was supposed to serve, and his passivity and indecisiveness in the campaigns of 1182–83 were, for Baldwin, not just a tactical error. It was a betrayal of the very spirit of the Crusader state, the spirit of desperate courage that the king himself had shown the world at Montgisard. Guy's removal was an act of desperation. The dying king, seeing his kingdom torn apart by ambitious barons, tried to build a system that would outlive him. The coronation of his 5-year-old nephew and the creation of a complex regency system were his last desperate attempts to save the country from inevitable chaos and civil war. The plan was meticulously thought out. Raymond of Tripoli would become regent for the child king. The young monarch's guardian would be Jocelyn de Courtenay, who belonged to the court party. This was done to maintain a balance of power. And the key fortresses of the kingdom were handed over to the control of the independent military orders of the Templars and Hospitallers. Moreover, trusting none of his barons, Baldwin decreed that if the young King Baldwin V died before reaching maturity, the question of succession to the throne between his mother, Sibylla, and her half-sister Isabella should be decided by the highest authorities in Europe, the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the kings of England and France. It was a desperate attempt to prevent a civil war. In March 1185, the 24-year-old Baldwin IV died. His short, agonizing, and heroic life came to an end. With him, the dam holding back the feuding court factions also broke. With his passing, the countdown for the Kingdom of Jerusalem began. The king's death was the beginning of the end. The throne, as willed, passed to the sickly boy, Baldwin V. The regent, Raymond of Tripoli, immediately concluded a 4-year truce with Saladin. But the fragile equilibrium did not last long. In the summer of 1186, the young king, not yet 9 years old, suddenly fell ill and died in Acre. The child's death blew up the political situation. According to Baldwin IV's will, the decision on the succession was to be made by European monarchs. But the court party had no intention of waiting. For them, this was a chance to regain power by placing their own pawn on the throne, the despised but pliable Guy de Lusignan. The young king's death was the spark to the powder keg, while the regent, Raymond of Tripoli, who was in the north, tried to act according to the law and convene the high court. His opponents in Jerusalem began to act, swiftly, decisively, and with absolute unscrupulousness. The time had come for a coup d'etat. At the head of the conspiracy was Princess Sibylla herself. At this decisive moment, she revealed herself as a cunning, powerful, and determined politician. She was supported by her uncle Jocelyn de Courtenay, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Gérard de Riedefort, and the old provocateur, Reynald de Chatillon. Their plan was audacious, cynical, and involved deceiving the entire kingdom. The conspirators' first step was a lavish funeral for the young king in Jerusalem. This allowed them, under the pretext of mourning, to gather all their supporters in the capital and take full control of the city. Raymond of Tripoli and his barons did not attend the funeral, fearing for their safety, which was immediately presented as an act of disrespect to the deceased. The next step was to secure the support of the church. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, Heraclius, a man known for his love of luxury, was entirely on the side of the conspirators. However, the main problem remained. The barons and the people were willing to accept Sibylla as queen, but they were adamantly opposed to seeing her husband Guy on the throne, whose reputation after the failed military campaigns was at rock bottom. Then Sibylla and her accomplices played out a brilliant and cynical scheme. They announced that Sibylla would be crowned as the sole ruler. But to do so, she had to take a public oath that she would immediately annul her marriage to Guy de Lusignan. In return, she would be granted the right to choose a new husband and king for herself. This was an offer that the High Court, assembled in Jerusalem without Raymond and his supporters, simply could not refuse. They were getting exactly what they wanted, to be rid of the hated Guy. Seeing no trick, the barons agreed to the deal, which turned out to be a clever trap. On the appointed day, a ceremony was held in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Patriarch Heraclius placed the crown on Sibylla's head, completing the first act of the drama. Now she was the rightful and legitimate Queen of Jerusalem. Everyone held their breath, waiting to see whom she would name as her new husband. And then the second act began. The Patriarch addressed the Queen with a speech, reminding her that she was a woman and the kingdom needed a strong male ruler. He invited her, as agreed, to name the one who would share the throne with her. The most tense moment had arrived. To the absolute astonishment of everyone present, Sibylla summoned Guy de Lusignan, who was standing in the crowd. Then she took the crown from her own head, handed it to her husband, and declared, "Those whom God has joined, let no man put asunder." With these words, she herself placed the crown on Guy's head. The stunned barons realized they had been outplayed. They had become participants in a farce that brought to power the very man they so despised. The Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard de Rochefort, one of the architects of the coup, whispered sarcastically that this crown was his personal revenge on Raymond of Tripoli, who had once deceived him. Few dared to protest. One of them, the old and respected Baron Gerard de Grenier, Lord of Saladin, loudly declared that he would not recognize Guy as king. But his lone voice was drowned out by the general chorus of the new regime's supporters. The resistance was broken. Upon learning of the coronation, Raymond and his party, gathered in Nablus, were furious. They refused to swear allegiance to Guy and even proposed crowning their own monarch, Sibylla's half-sister, Isabella. The kingdom was on the brink of a full-scale civil war. However, Isabella's husband, the young and not overly ambitious Humphrey of Turan, did not want to play this game. During the night, he secretly left Nablus, arrived in Jerusalem, and swore fealty to Guy and Sibylla. This act broke the will of the rebellious barons. Realizing that a civil war in the face of Saladin was suicide, they submitted one by one. The last to refuse to recognize Guy was Raymond of Tripoli himself. In anger and resentment, he went to his domains in Tiberias and committed an act that many considered treason. He made a separate peace with Saladin. The kingdom's chief baron preferred an alliance with the enemy to serving a king he hated. Thus, Guy de Lusignan reached the summit. He sat on the throne of David and Godfrey of Bouillon, but he had obtained it not through valor, but through his wife's cunning and intrigue. His crown was fragile. He was the king of a divided kingdom, despised by the best barons and surrounded by adventurers. And across the border, Saladin, observing this chaos, knew that his hour had come. while the kingdom of Jerusalem was consuming itself from within. A process that would become its death sentence was being completed on its borders. The Islamic world had united under the rule of a new, brilliant leader. His name was Saladin, and the main goal of his life was to expel the Franks from the Holy Land. The enemy had united and become lethally dangerous. To understand the scale of the threat, one must understand who Saladin was. He was not a random adventurer like Guy. A Kurd by origin, he began his career in the service of the Syrian ruler Nur al-Din, who was the first to proclaim the idea of jihad. His path to power was long, difficult, and well-earned. Sent to Egypt by his patron, Saladin became the ruler of that wealthy country after his patron's death. Then, step by step, he subjugated Damascus, Aleppo, and other Muslim cities. By 1186, he had created a vast empire that held the kingdom of Jerusalem in an iron grip from the south and east. Saladin was the complete opposite of the bloodthirsty Saracen image painted by European propaganda. Deeply religious, generous, just, and chivalrously noble, he commanded respect even among his enemies. Frankish barons, like Raymond, understood that this was a man with whom one could and should negotiate. However, for all his nobility, the main goal of his life was the liberation of Jerusalem, which Muslims call Al-Quds. For Islam, it is the third holiest site after Mecca and Medina. The presence of the Franks in the holy city was an unhealed wound, and Saladin swore that he would be the surgeon to heal it. For a long time, occupied with unifying the Muslim world, Saladin avoided a full-scale war, concluding truces with Baldwin IV, whom he deeply respected. But with the death of the martyr king and the accession of Guy and the war party, the situation changed. Saladin realized that the new government of Jerusalem would pursue an aggressive policy, and he was not mistaken. The catalyst that shattered the fragile peace was Reynold de Chatillon. This adventurer, who had spent 16 years in Muslim captivity, had only grown more embittered. As the Lord of Ultra-Jourdain, he controlled the rich caravan routes leading from Egypt to Syria and had the perfect opportunity for plunder. His castle, Kerak, loomed over the trade routes like a bird of prey's nest. For Reynold, no truces existed. He sincerely believed that plundering Muslim caravans was not only profitable, but also a godly act, and no treaties could stop him. In 1181, he carried out his most daring raid. He built a fleet on the Red Sea and attacked ships carrying pilgrims to Mecca. This act of sacrilege caused outrage throughout the Islamic world, and Reynold himself became Saladin's personal enemy. The Sultan publicly swore that he would kill this man with his own hands. In late 1186, in violation of the current truce, Reynold committed his final fatal provocation. He attacked a huge and wealthy caravan traveling from Cairo to Damascus, seizing immense treasures and many prisoners. When news of this reached Saladin, his patience finally ran out. The Sultan sent envoys to King Guy with a just demand: return the captured goods, release the prisoners, and punish Reynold. Any reasonable ruler in Guy's position would have immediately complied with this demand to avoid war. But Guy was not a reasonable ruler. He found himself trapped. He owed his throne to the war party and to Reynold de Chatillon himself. In response to the king's demand to submit, Reynold defiantly declared that he was the lord of his own land and had no truce with the Saracens. The king became a hostage of his own allies. Faced with the choice of reigning in his most powerful ally or accepting Saladin's challenge, Guy couldn't or wouldn't show firmness. He sent the Sultan's envoys away with nothing. This response was tantamount to a declaration of war. He made the choice that sealed his fate and the fate of his kingdom. For Saladin, This was the long-awaited pretext. He could now declare a holy war not as an aggressor, but as the injured party whose rights had been violated. He began to assemble a massive army from all corners of his empire. In Jerusalem, the alarm was also raised. Guy declared a general mobilization. Faced with an imminent threat, even Raymond of Tripoli forgot his grievances. He broke his separate peace with Saladin, reconciled with the king, and arrived with his contingent to join the army. The kingdom united in the face of mortal danger, but this unity was belated and very fragile. In the summer of 1187, in the scorching heat of Galilee, the entire military might of the Kingdom of Jerusalem gathered at the springs of Sapphira. It was a strategically perfect position. With abundant water and pasture, it was practically invulnerable to attack. Any enemy who dared to assault this camp would be doomed to defeat. Guy's army was the largest the kingdom had ever fielded, about 20,000 men, including 1,200 heavily armed knights and thousands of warrior monks from the Templar and Hospitaller orders. They also had their most sacred relic, the true cross. The Christians were confident in their strength. Saladin, whose army was significantly larger, understood perfectly well the disadvantage of attacking Sapphira. His plan was different. He had to lure the Franks out of their fortified camp into open, waterless terrain, where his light cavalry would have a decisive advantage. For this, he devised a diabolically clever bait. On July 2nd, 1187, Saladin besieged the city of Tiberias. The city belonged to Raymond of Tripoli, and his wife was in its citadel. News of the siege immediately reached the Christian camp, causing a storm. Guy immediately convened a war council to decide what to do. At the council, Raymond spoke first. He stated that the siege of Tiberias was an obvious trap, and although it was his city and his wife, he was prepared to sacrifice them to save the army. He explained that the march to Tiberias lay through a waterless desert, and the army would die of thirst before the battle even began. His words were a grim and accurate prophecy. He insisted they should stay put, as Saladin would not be able to supply his huge army for long and would soon be forced to retreat. Most of the experienced barons supported his wise advice. It seemed that King Guy agreed with this decision, and the army would remain in the safe camp. But that night, his chief advisors, Gerard de Riedfort and Reynald de Chatillon, came to the king's tent. They accused Raymond of cowardice and treason, whispering poison into the weak monarch's ears. They played on his greatest fear, of appearing indecisive again, as he had in past campaigns. Weak and susceptible to others' influence, Guy broke. He reversed his previous decision and gave the order to march on Tiberias at dawn. In the morning, hearing the trumpets announcing the start of the march, Raymond exclaimed that all was lost and the kingdom was doomed. He obeyed the order, but he knew he was leading the army to its death. The march into hell began, 25 kilometers across a waterless plateau under the scorching July sun. The Christians' main enemy became agonizing thirst. Water quickly ran out, armor grew white-hot, and thick dust choked their throats, making it hard to breathe. The army began to die long before it met the enemy. Learning that the Franks had fallen into his trap, Saladin moved to meet them. His light horse archers surrounded the exhausted column, showering it with arrows without engaging in close combat. The Saracens also set fire to the dry grass, and the acrid smoke, driven by the wind, worsened the Christians' unbearable suffering, turning their march into a living hell. By evening, the exhausted and completely dehydrated army halted for the night in a dry valley at the foot of the hills, known as the Horns of Hattin. They never reached water. Now, they were completely surrounded by Saladin's army. The trap had snapped shut, definitively and irrevocably. The night turned into a nightmare. The cries of the wounded mingled with the loud prayers and the beating of Saracen drums, which kept the enemy from sleeping. The Muslims knew the job was done, and in the morning, they would only have to finish off this dying, cornered beast. At dawn on the 4th of July, the agony began. The infantry, maddened by thirst, broke ranks in an attempt to reach the distant Sea of Galilee and were immediately cut down or captured. Only the contingent of Raymond of Tripoli, leading the vanguard, managed to fight its way through the encirclement and escape. The final battle raged on one of the hills, where Guy, Reynaud, and the surviving knights made their stand around the red royal tent. They fought with the fury of despair, but in the heat of the fight, the warrior carrying the true cross fell. With the loss of their greatest relic, the Christian spirit was broken. The resistance ceased. The king and all his barons were taken prisoner. The army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem ceased to exist. On the scorched plateau near the horns of Hattin lay thousands of corpses, becoming food for vultures and jackals. The catastrophe was total, crushing, and final. The victory at Hattin was the greatest triumph of Saladin's life. The noblest prisoners, led by King Guy, were brought to his tent. What happened next became a legend, one that fully revealed both the Sultan's chivalrous nobility and his unyielding resolve. Saladin invited the thirst-tormented Guy to sit beside him and ordered a cup of iced sherbet to be brought. According to Arab laws of hospitality, sharing food and drink with a prisoner meant granting him his life. But when Guy, after taking a sip, passed the cup to Reynaud de Chatillon, who was standing nearby, the Sultan's expression changed. Saladin sternly explained that it was the king who had given Reynaud a drink, not he himself. The guarantee of safety did not extend to the Sultan's most hated enemy. He reminded Reynaud of all his crimes and broken oaths, offering him the chance to convert to Islam to save his life. Reynaud proudly refused. Then Saladin fulfilled his long-held oath. He stood up, drew his sword, and struck Reynaud de Chatillon a blow on the neck. His guards immediately finished the job, beheading the prisoner. The revenge the Sultan had awaited for so many years was finally accomplished. Guy trembled, thinking he would be next, but Saladin reassured him, uttering the famous words, "Kings do not kill kings." He explained that Reynaud had crossed all acceptable boundaries. This episode revealed the full essence of Saladin, merciful to an equal in status, but ruthless to one he considered an enemy of the faith and an oath-breaker. This duality was also reflected in the fate of the other prisoners. All the captured Templars and Hospitallers, whom Saladin considered not ordinary soldiers, but fanatical enemies of Islam, met a terrible fate. They were offered a choice: convert to Islam or die. Almost all of the 230 warrior monks chose a martyr's death and were beheaded. For Guy de Lusignan, a long and honorable captivity began. He and other noble barons were sent to Damascus, where they were treated with all due respect. He was a king without a kingdom, a prisoner guest. And while he was in captivity, his country, left without an army and without defenders, crumbled like a house of cards. Saladin wasted no time. Immediately after the battle, his army marched swiftly through Palestine. Cities and castles, left without garrisons, surrendered one after another, often without a fight. By September 1187, almost the entire kingdom, except for a few fortresses in the city of Tyre, was in the Sultan's hands. Finally, Saladin approached his main objective, Jerusalem. The city's defense was led by Baldwin of Ibelin, who had managed to escape capture at Hattin. There were few soldiers in the city, but Baldwin organized a desperate resistance. knighting all the boys from noble families and even common citizens. After the assault began, Baldwin, realizing the hopelessness of the resistance, went to negotiate. By threatening to destroy the Muslim holy sites and kill all the prisoners, he secured merciful terms of surrender from Saladin. The Christians could leave the city alive by paying a ransom for themselves. These terms were incredibly lenient, especially compared to the monstrous massacre the Crusaders had carried out when they took the city in 1099. Saladin acted differently. He allowed many of the poor to leave without ransom, and on October 2nd, 1187, he triumphantly entered the city on the anniversary of the Prophet Muhammad's ascension. After 88 years of Frankish rule, Jerusalem was once again Muslim. News of this came as a shock to the entire Christian world and prompted the organization of the Third Crusade. And Guy de Lusignan, the architect of the catastrophe, sat in Damascus all this time, and it seemed his story was well and truly over. But in 1188, Saladin performed a noble, but as it turned out, short-sighted act. True to the word he had given in his tent, he released Guy from captivity, taking an oath from him never to fight against Muslims again. Guy immediately found a priest who absolved him of this oath, declaring that a promise made to an infidel was not binding. Guy was a king without a kingdom. His barons despised him. When he arrived in Tyre, the only major city that had held out thanks to the courage of a new hero, Conrad of Montferrat, he was humiliatingly refused entry. Guy became an exile from the last remnant of his own country. When Guy and his small retinue approached the gates of Tyre, Conrad of Montferrat, who had declared himself the city's defender, refused to let him in. The exiled king was forced to spend several months in a wretched camp outside the city walls. It seemed he was finally broken, and his story had come to an ignominious end. But it was here, at the very nadir of his fall, that Guy de Lusignan displayed a completely unexpected quality: unbending stubbornness. Gathering all who remained loyal to him in August 1189, he did the unthinkable. He marched south and, with a small force, laid siege to the huge, well-fortified port city of Acre. It was a sheer gamble, like a mouse trying to swallow an elephant. Saladin, upon learning that the deposed king with a handful of men was besieging one of his best cities, at first didn't believe it, and then he laughed. He was sure he could easily destroy this small force, but he was mistaken. The great, nearly 2-year-long siege of Acre had begun. Guy's camp under the walls of Acre quickly became a magnet for all the Christian forces arriving from the west in anticipation of the Third Crusade. His small detachment grew into a full-fledged army. Soon, the situation was reversed. The Christians were besieging the Muslim garrison of Acre, while Saladin's huge relief army was besieging the Christian camp. Life in the camp was terrible. Famine, disease, constant attacks from two sides. But the besiegers held on. And Guy, who had failed spectacularly as a field commander at Hattin, surprisingly proved to be a steadfast and tenacious leader in the grueling conditions of positional warfare. He personally took part in the fighting and kept his soldiers' spirits up. In the autumn of 1190, an epidemic swept through the camp. Among its many victims were Queen Sibylla and their 2 young daughters. His wife's death was not only a personal tragedy for Guy, but also a political catastrophe. His only claim to the throne had been his marriage to her, and now his claims to the crown became extremely dubious. His opponents, led by Conrad of Montferrat, immediately took advantage of this. They pulled off a cynical political maneuver. They forcibly abducted the rightful heir to the throne, Sibylla's younger sister Isabella, forcibly annulled her marriage, and immediately married her to Conrad. As a result, in what was left of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, there were now two kings. The first was Guy de Lusignan, who had lost his legal right to the throne, but was in de facto command of the army at Acre. The second was Conrad of Montferrat, the husband of the rightful heiress. The Christian camp was split in two right in the face of the enemy. In the spring of 1191, the main forces of the Third Crusade arrived in the Holy Land, led by King Philip Augustus of France and King Richard the Lionheart of England. Their arrival dramatically shifted the balance of power, but also brought old European politics and rivalries into the camp. The kings were immediately drawn into the local dispute. Philip Augustus supported his kinsman, Conrad. Richard the Lionheart, who was the Lusignans' overlord in Europe and a longtime enemy of the French king, supported Guy. The dispute over who was the legitimate king became the main bone of contention in the Crusader camp. Nevertheless, the arrival of fresh forces made it possible to break the garrison's resistance. In July 1191, after a 2-year siege, Acre fell. Richard and Philip had to act as arbiters in the dispute over the crown. A compromise was reached. Guy would remain king for the rest of his life, but after his death, the throne would pass to Conrad and Isabella. This solution satisfied no one. Soon, Philip Augustus, citing illness, left for France, leaving Richard as the sole leader of the crusade. The barons of the Holy Land continued to pressure the English king, demanding that the crown be given to the stronger and more competent Conrad. Support for Guy, despite his fortitude at Acre, was dwindling. In the end, Richard, needing the support of the local barons for his march on Jerusalem, was forced to yield. He stripped Guy of his royal title. It seemed that for Lusignan, this was the final end. But Richard and fate had other, completely unexpected plans for him. His own island. Depriving Guy of the crown was an act of pure political pragmatism. But Richard had no intention of abandoning his loyal vassal to his fate. He needed to find a consolation prize for Guy, and such a prize appeared quite by chance, thanks to Richard's conquest of the island of Cyprus. In the spring of 1191, on his way to the Holy Land, Richard's fleet was caught in a storm. The ship carrying his sister and his fiancée was wrecked on the coast of Cyprus. The local ruler, the self-proclaimed Emperor Isaac Komnenos, took them captive and plundered their belongings, provoking a swift and furious reaction from the English king. Within a matter of weeks, Richard defeated Isaac's army, captured the entire island, and took the emperor himself prisoner. Legend has it that, having promised not to put him in iron chains, Richard had him bound in chains of silver. Thus, the English king unexpectedly became the owner of a rich and strategically important island. At first, Richard, not knowing what to do with this acquisition, sold the island to the Knights Templar. But their brutal and inept rule sparked a rebellion on Cyprus. The Templars quickly realized that governing an entire island was a troublesome and thankless task, and decided to get rid of this problematic asset as soon as possible. And it was then that Richard saw a solution to two problems at once. He offered to return the Templars' deposit and to hand the island over to Guy de Lusignan. In exchange, Guy would have to definitively renounce all his claims to the crown of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. In May 1192, the deal was struck. Thus, Guy de Lusignan, the man who had lost one kingdom, completely unexpectedly for everyone, including himself, received another. He became the absolute lord of Cyprus. Formally, he did not yet bear the title of king. His brother and heir, Aimery, would adopt it. But it was Guy who became the founder of a new and surprisingly long-lasting dynasty. On Cyprus, Guy, taught by bitter experience, acted as a wise and far-sighted ruler. To consolidate his power on an island with a hostile Greek population, he invited hundreds of landless Frankish knights from Palestine. He granted them lands on terms of feudal service, creating a fully fledged Western-style system on Cyprus. Guy ruled Cyprus for only 2 years. He died in 1194, leaving no direct heirs. He was succeeded by his brother Amory, who, by marrying the widowed Isabella, briefly united the crowns of both Cyprus and Jerusalem under his rule. But the foundation laid by Guy proved to be solid. And this is the main, most astonishing paradox of his life. The man whose name is forever linked with the catastrophe and the loss of the Kingdom of Jerusalem became the founder of another kingdom that proved to be surprisingly durable. The Lusignan dynasty ruled Cyprus for nearly 300 years, outlasting all the other Crusader states. So, who was he? Guy de Lusignan. He was certainly not a great commander or a wise strategist. His indecisiveness and susceptibility to others' influence led to the tragedy at Hattin. But his incredible stubbornness during the siege of Acre and his pragmatic actions on Cyprus show that he was not the complete nonentity he is often portrayed as. Perhaps the most accurate description of him is a man who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. A typical representative of the second tier of the aristocracy, handsome and brave in single combat, he lacked the strategic thinking and strength of character needed to govern a state at the sharp end of a civilizational conflict. His story is a classic medieval tragedy of the Wheel of Fortune. A woman's love and a confluence of circumstances raised him to the summit. His own shortcomings brought him crashing down into the mud. But in his case, fortune took one last turn, granting him at the end of his life a prize that proved to be more lasting and durable than the great kingdom he had lost. In the court of history, Guy de Lusignan is most often the chief defendant in the case of the fall of Jerusalem. The verdict, delivered by both his contemporaries and popular culture, is harsh and unequivocal. He is guilty. Guilty of weakness, incompetence, and leading the flower of chivalry to a senseless death. And there are solid grounds for such a verdict. The objective facts are relentless. It was during his short reign that the decisive battle was lost and the holy city was taken. History does not favor losers, and Guy lost on a grand scale, forever remaining a pale shadow against the backdrop of Baldwin IV's heroism and Saladin's nobility. However, if one tries to play the role of a defense attorney, the picture becomes less clear-cut. Can the entire blame for a catastrophe that had been brewing for decades be placed on one man who ruled for just a year? Guy did not create the kingdom's problems. He inherited them: the division among the elite, demographic weakness, and most importantly, a brilliant enemy in the form of Saladin. His fatal mistake, the decision to march to the relief of Tiberius, was undoubtedly his. But did he have a real choice? Refusing to save the city amid a storm of accusations of cowardice from the war party could have led to a mutiny in the army. He was a hostage of the very forces that had brought him to power and was forced to play by their rules. His subsequent biography, the humiliations at the walls of Tyre, the incredible persistence at Acre, and the acquisition of Cyprus, paints a picture of a man far more complex than a caricature of a failure. He was a man whom fate first undeservedly gifted and then cruelly tested. And though he failed the main test, he found the strength to rise after his fall. Ultimately, his legacy is profoundly paradoxical. He lost Jerusalem, but founded a dynasty that outlasted the kingdom of Jerusalem itself. He went down in history as a symbol of the greatest defeat, yet his descendants held a royal title for far longer than the descendants of many of his victorious contemporaries. Perhaps the true tragedy of Guy de Lusignan is not that he was bad or evil, but that he was ordinary. Fate thrust him into a role that demanded truly titanic qualities. He was given the lead part in a great historical drama, but like an actor, he could never quite rise to its scale, getting lost against the grand backdrop. And although history, like a stern critic, has cast him in the role of a tragic failure, there is something more to his error-filled fate. This story shows how multifaceted people we are accustomed to judging in simple terms can be. We will continue to tell stories of such complex figures, so subscribe to our channel, give us a like, and share your opinion in the comments.